Order! Silence in court! Order! Silence in court! I would like to declare the case of movie trialers versus the accused now open.
Welcome to the movie trials. In the dock today is Oliver Stone's 1986 movie, Platoon. Representing the movie trialers, your host and the prosecution, I am Smart Alec. And sat beside me is the defendant. He is known as none other than Adam. Say hello, Adam.
Good afternoon. Hi.
Platoon stands accused of being pretentious in the first degree. How do you plead?
Not guilty.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Platoon is a very pretentious film. Now, to explain to you what I mean by that, we need only look at the meaning of the word pretentious. It's an adjective characterised by the assumption of self-importance, especially when it's exaggerated or undeserved, with no factual basis for that importance. And that's how I feel that Oliver Stone presents Platoon to us. It's a ponderous, overly long film that has a distinct lack of focus. It's effectively a propaganda piece that just over and over again tries to enforce its message, and it's almost insufferable. There are many other films that have a message, American History X, for example, or even other propaganda pieces like Battleship Potemkin. But even those, I didn't feel that the message was forced, and that's why this film is on trial, because of how it sacrifices all of the nuances of good filmmaking to make a point. This film is guilty in the first degree of being pretentious, and I hope that you, the jury, can agree with me and find it guilty. Thank you. Platoon. Never have I seen such an overt example of pretentiousness, ponderousness, and blatant propaganda.
I don't agree at all with any of those points, except perhaps the last one, but we'll get to that.
Okay, so let's start with why it's ponderous. This is a film that marches along as slowly as the soldiers do throughout the film.
Yes.
This is a film that is 2 hours long, and huge swathes of the film are dedicated to soldiers sitting, to soldiers staring, to soldiers dealing with bugs.
I really can't
soldiers.
disagree with you when it comes to that. Yeah, I'd say easily an hour of the film focuses on the soldiers and on fairly uneventful things that happen in their everyday lives. That's sort of the point, though. The tedium of war, the introduction was as we're introduced to the soldiers and they're walking through the forest, or the jungle rather. Essentially nothing happens, other than the fact that Charlie Sheen gets bitten by bugs. I don't take any issue in the fact that it's slow and that it builds. I feel that adds to the suspense of the film. And I feel like it sort of adds to this idea that lots of the soldiers' lives isn't death. The thing that depresses them, the fact that death is around the corner or could happen at any moment, and that their lives are tedious and boring. And they find ways to get around that.
This isn't a new concept. This isn't something that was just created and shown in Platoon. But many films have been able to capture this essence without the need to fill vast amounts of time with watching other men staring. And
I don't have a problem with men staring, to be honest. But I wonder whether that was the case in 1986 when Platoon came out.
I don't pick on its ponderous nature just because it contains a lot of walking. There is so much walking in this film.
It's a big country.
That would be okay, and you say that it's all about building this message that the film tries to force down our throats, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's the fact that there's such a thin story holding this all together. It's a very simplistic plot, and there's no real focus, which is why I specifically think it's ponderous. Most of the film is a collection of scenes, normally of people talking on behalf of Oliver Stone.
I don't agree with you there. That I feel Oliver Stone's hand in it is obvious, but I really don't agree that it's just Oliver Stone's sort of talking heads citing.
But I feel it really is, and you have lots of very one-dimensional characters. Some of them can't act very well.
That's true. I mean, Charlie Sheen is perhaps not the greatest actor. That was one thing I do have to agree with you on.
And yeah, you've got uninteresting characters talking, walking, snorting, and shitting. It does lack narrative focus, especially once Elias dies. The central conflict of the film is essentially over.
No, I really don't.
And it branches off towards its conclusion, but it doesn't. I wouldn't say that was a focused and succinct storyline.
I would agree with you that
opposite.
it's a very simple story, but I feel like most stories, when you boil them down to their component parts, are incredibly simple. This is really about Charlie Sheen's character Chris's journey as he enters Vietnam by choice, and really then he's the eyes of the audience, and he shows us what's going on. And he's essentially the audience identification figure, and it's just about his journey and his trials and tribulations and what he confronts and how he comes out the other side. I feel that that's sort of the main thrust of the film. There's definitely an allegorical message there, and I feel like that's what adds to the complexity. When you interpret the film in a certain way, you can easily see Oliver Stone's voice there. But I really don't agree at all that it's ponderous or slow. I think that perhaps you've now come to expect a certain level of pacing or cutting from a film that just wasn't the style at the time, and I really don't feel like the film loses anything or that any of the message is detracted from by sort of interludes or by moments of quiet.
I mean, there are many lengthy films. There are many films that aren't action-packed.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the scenes in this film really lack a purpose,
Really?
other than to enforce Oliver Stone's message.
Could you give me an example of a purposeless scene in that film? I'm not saying that every scene progressed the plot perfectly or was there solely to develop characters, but are there any especially purposeless
Well,
scenes?
for example, with Keith David's character King, just before he leaves, he and Charlie Sheen's character have a long discussion, and it goes on for about 5-6 minutes.
I won't hear a word said against Keith David. I think he's a wonderful actor. He was one of the better actors in the film.
I didn't say he specifically was a bad actor,
And I feel
whereas
like-
Junior probably was. There's quite a few just sit down, two people talking conversations where they talk about the rich not having to fight these wars, but only the poor having to fight these wars, and talking about what's it all for, and talking about pussy. And
I don't know whether or not those conversations moved the plot forwards, which they probably didn't, but they're there so that you identify with the characters, so that their deaths matter, or so that their lives matter, so that you actually care about them. I don't really have an issue with any of that.
But I didn't feel like I did care about any of these characters.
That's a problem with you as a person. That's something you should perhaps look at.
I mean, even Charlie Sheen and Elias's characters, so that's Willem Dafoe's Elias and Charlie Sheen's Chris Taylor, both of them, I still, even then I just had a problem believing their characters because I just felt they were a conduit.
Did you not feel, when Elias is shot and killed, were you not moved by that? I mean, that's one of the famous posters. That's one of the famous scenes in the film.
It is famous.
Him on his knees with his arms thrown back, assuming this sort of Christ-like pose. I was really moved by that.
I mean, to me, that broke into, like, it was just so melodramatic. You were being beat over the head with Barber's adagio for strings multiple times throughout that film, and I felt it was telling. It was very representative of the film as a whole. The fact that you were persistently and constantly bludgeoned with this piece of music whenever you were supposed to feel an intense sense of heartbreak and horror. And Elias's character was almost ridiculous at points. And okay, so we're moving into why this film is pretentious.
Okay, but before you do, I'd just say that the use of Barber's adagio for strings has now been parodied to death, and it's become a cliche. In the same way that following The Matrix, the idea of having sort of bullet time effects in a film became completely overdone. I feel like this is one of the films that set the cliche, that created the idea of a powerful piece of music being used as a recurrent theme.
Sure, and I accept that point, but what I don't accept is that it's done well in this film, because I feel that it's really not. It's as blunt and obvious as most of the messages that you're battered with throughout this film. I really didn't like his death scene.
You really didn't?
For a start, I found it difficult to suspend my disbelief that he had been shot and was still able to make it as far as he did. I don't mind things like that in films as long as they make sense within the context of the film, and it didn't make sense that he would survive to that point. And everything that he was meant to represent, he was like Jesus Christ in this film.
I mean, Willem Dafoe did end up starring in The Passion of the Christ.
He was a flawless character.
No, not at all. I think the film was slightly down on his drug use for a start. And he was slightly...
Really? I'd say it glorified it, if anything.
I don't think I agree with the fact that they glorified his behaviour. I'd say that he is definitely a more Christ-like figure in this film than anyone else, and he is definitely one of the more objectively good characters in the film.
The way he smiles at Barnes, it's like he knew that he was going to kill him, and he was dying for our sins. You know, it was it was laughable, personally.
I didn't find it laughable at all. I was really moved by that scene. I was able to suspend disbelief because it served a role within the narrative of the film. Perhaps the idea of getting shot and then continuing running is unrealistic, but I feel like also it's something that isn't entirely unbelievable. In the same way that people catching stray bullets or someone managing to avoid an airstrike, at the end when the only two people left alive are Barnes and Chris, the fact that it was only the two of them and there were no Viet Cong left alive, the fact that's you suspending your disbelief there. You want to believe that there's no one else there watching him, no one else is alive and able to see it. That was very convenient. And I think that's the case in lots of films, that there is an element of the story has to be just so in order for the message to work. Okay. Or in order for the film to function.
It's just this instance, that's a valid point, but this instance just felt more obvious to me, and it was the way it was done, and
I gasped. I was shocked.
Were you?
I actually was. I've seen that film before, admittedly as a child, but I was really shocked.
I saw this as a child?
Yeah, I forget. I forget which channel it was on, but yes, I did.
Okay.
A long time ago.
I feel that as soon as Elias had been killed, did lose its direction, and even though I think the ending of the film is actually one of the strongest parts of it, you have the intense battle scene, the chaos that it brings, unlike earlier battle scenes where it just focuses on numerous wounded soldiers. This one manages to do that, but also keep driving the narrative forwards. Yeah, I feel that this is almost a separate film by this point. As you said, you had the contrived moment where they all got blown up, and then it's just the two characters left standing, Sergeant Barnes and Chris, and then he takes power into his own hands and kills him. But by this point, the film had lost me.
Where did the film lose?
The film lost me when he dropped to the floor dead, because Oliver Stone didn't really know where the film was going from that point. It wasn't as clear-cut. Not that it was clear-cut before, when they were meandering through the jungle.
I still can't get over the fact you had a problem with the jungle meandering, because that's what the Vietnam War was all about, was wandering through jungles.
Yeah, but I just feel there's smarter and better ways of showing that than literally just using 20 to 40 minutes of screen time showing people actually walking around.
All of the events of the film will have to take place in Vietnam, and most of that takes place in the jungle. So any movement through the jungle has to involve those scenes, unless they just appear miraculously in clearings to have firefights and then...
And you know that characters use the toilet. That doesn't mean you have to show a character going toilet, you know?
This is true, but then I don't feel like this film has the motif of characters defecating. I don't know whether the idea of people emptying their bowels really has any weight with the story that's being told, whereas the idea of getting lost in the jungle, this alien element, and also just the sheer tedium of it, is something that supplements the story.
Tedium came across, but it wasn't from the story.
Yeah, those scenes felt like they were deliberately tedious, but they weren't tedious for me as a viewer, they were tedious for the people within them. I felt that there was this element of people just waiting.
Mm.
And watching it, knowing that things would happen, it built the suspense for me. Those scenes really served to heighten the moments of action that happen afterwards, to heighten the close quarter fighting or the firefights that happen afterwards.
They just, for me, they lack the focus to really raise tension for me. And any tension that was created was just a natural, innate tension that I'd have when anyone's getting shot at. I don't need a film to have action set piece after action set piece to hold my attention. I just need to be captivated by something, and this didn't captivate me. This is a pretentious film. If you look up pretentious in the dictionary, there's a picture of Oliver Stone's face.
That may be the case. I don't know whether I can argue with that, but I don't think it's a pretentious film, particularly.
I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This film bludgeons you to death as an audience member with its message. And it does this through the music, through the narrative, through the distinctly contrasting and ultimately single-faceted characters, specifically Elias and Barnes. And it's so melodramatic that it's hilarious in places. This is a film that's about the horrors of war. This is about the horrors of watching Platoon, for me. I felt like this was a chore to watch.
I feel like this film is actually about what the horrors of war do to us. If I really saw this as a very clearly allegorical film. And I can't really argue with the fact that it is propaganda, in the sense that it does definitely present a certain political point of view. It is designed to look at Vietnam in a certain way.
But just on the pretentious issue,
Okay.
do you not feel that these are very broad strokes and very simple characters to drive a message? Do you feel that there's no subtlety? This isn't a film that someone has made to make a quality film that has these themes running through it. This is an anti-war film that has some vague themes encompassing the characters in the background.
No, I don't agree with that.
Basically, my point is that it's not subtle, and this isn't necessarily a good film. This might be a very good anti-war film.
Well, I would say that your issues with it seemed, the sort of ponderous segment of it, was that it was very slow, that it showed lots of things that weren't actually fighting. That there were huge chunks of it that were
I don't mind not
just...
fighting, it's just purposeless. They're
But their
purposelessness.
lives are purposeless, and their lives are full of purposelessness. They sit there and, well, they're men who don't know each other very well. They're gathered from all over the states.
If you remove the anti-war sentimentality of the film,
I
what's left?
really don't think that's fair. I feel like every filmmaker, when they make a film, has an intention or a message.
I disagree with that. Have you seen Pulp Fiction?
I would say that Quentin Tarantino's own personal views, his foot fetish, among other things, definitely come through in his work, and his politics and his sort of... all his films are very anarchic, and I feel like that sort of may hint towards his own political views.
So you don't think this film's pretentious?
You
think the message is justified and it's done in a way that you're okay with?
I think that this film has pretensions. It aims to address the viewer in a certain way and intends to really get to the root of their own views on war, which I feel like this may be where we differ over the next segment of it, over whether or not it's propaganda. But it's really... I didn't feel that it was simplistic. I feel that it tells a very simple story in a very nuanced way. I feel the individual characters are perhaps quite simple. You're introduced to a very large cast who you don't get to know very well. But I didn't have nearly the same issue with you.
It's a very self-important film.
Self-important how? I don't think the film ever stops to regard it.
Fair point, but Oliver Stone has created a film that is embroiled in its own self-importance.
Is it? I feel it's a film that tells a very simple story. It's set in an interesting setting.
Adagio for Strings tells me that it's well aware of what it is and what it aims to achieve.
Adagio for Strings is a very sad piece of music, independently of whatever it is that's going on next to it. This is true. But I don't have a problem with the way the music was used, or perhaps if the film were made now, it would be done differently. But I think they would still use that piece of music, but perhaps they'd tone it down slightly, or have it more in the background, or have it recur less. But I don't think that a film's awareness of its viewers' emotions is a film that is inherently pretentious. I feel like all films attempt to push the viewer's emotional buttons in order to elicit certain responses.
Okay.
I don't feel this film did it badly. It wasn't a film that made me cry. It wasn't a film that evoked terror or dread or sadness or deep thought in me throughout. But at the end of it, I definitely felt like I had seen a fairly harrowing film.
Not even the village scene.
The village scene did really affect me. All of the village scene, actually, from when they first enter it until the rape is broken up, was all very, very harrowing. And actually, that's a fair point. During the film, that did really affect me.
I saw that it affected you. You're right. It is a deeply harrowing scene. I don't disagree with that. But there is a strong but. Again, it all... I think it's like these adverts you see on television, showing you the horrors of child abuse and various other things like that.
I know, how pretentious.
Not that it's pretentious, just they're designed in such a way to evoke outrage. And I feel that is what that scene does. And I feel that it's...
I do really think that witnessing man's inhumanity to man is probably enough to evoke outrage. I think that actually outrage was brought to the American public and to the public in general by the Vietnam War, just by showing and casually stating what it was that went on.
But I feel your buttons are pushed by the scene.
I would say that depicting what happened to the Vietnamese people just depicting that in any way possible would still evoke a response in me.
And rightly so, but it wasn't what they suffered. It was just the way it was portrayed in this film. It allowed no quarter. All the characters just lost their minds. Even Charlie Sheen's character, Chris, he goes berserk. It's not congruous with his character development throughout the film.
It's entirely understandable.
This is a piece of fiction. It's not understandable.
They've just seen one of the members of their platoon there gutted and stabbed and choked and whatever, and he's dead and he's tied to a post. And off the basis of that, they then go into this village ready for combat and ready to exact revenge upon the people in the village.
Chris is portrayed as a very middle-of-the-road character in regards to his alignment, specifically between Elias and Barnes. And it didn't make sense to me. His character suddenly switched to a maniac who's shooting a man's feet to make him dance for him.
At a man's foot.
At a man's foot, thank you, to dance for him. And it just seemed completely out of character because Oliver Stone doesn't care at this point. He just wants you to be enraged. And Elias is the only Jesus Christ is the only character who comes through and breaks things up.
He is the only character who's capable of standing up. That you see during even after, I think the character's name is Bunny, even after Bunny kills the mentally handicapped man and then kills his mother or grandmother, you can see Charlie Sheen comes out white and he feels sick. And even the character of O'Neill, the squad sergeant, comes out and he feels sick.
Yeah, John C. McGinley.
Dr. Cox comes out and he's horrified. And
who wouldn't be? But
of course,
my point is you shouldn't not be horrified. I just think that he just sacrificed
his
all the characters to make a point.
That's one of his very first combat experiences and one of the first times that the reality of what they're facing has been brought home to him. You can see even when he's angry with this man for smiling at him, he's terrified at the same time. The scene before that, where he's being told to leave him alone, and he says, they're scared. Well, what about me? I'm scared. I think that entire scene builds up to the point where Sergeant Barnes kills that Vietnamese woman and then holds her daughter at gunpoint. Up until that point, we've been building and building and building. All the tension, all the slowness, all the slow-pacedness has all been brought home all at once.
I personally didn't feel that. There was definitely tension when he had the gun to the child's head, but I thought that was because of the fact he had a gun to the child's head, not because of anything that came before it.
But him holding the gun to the child's head only makes sense in the context of what's just happened before that. I would say that even the character of Barnes, who sort of represents the dark side of war, even he is pushed to that event. When that woman continues talking to him and shouting about her dead pig and how upset he is, you can see the line that he crosses over and he can't come back from.
It's a very simplistic view of morality, though. You've got bad soldiers and innocent villagers, and there's no in between.
What about
Or-
Jesus Christ himself?
or
who's
Jesus
the soldier
Christ
who comes to
hims-
save
yeah,
them?
but he's
Or Charlie Sheen who feels guilty
well,
about
no, because
what he does?
his character doesn't matter at that point. He just becomes one of the other soldiers, and I feel that there'll be many soldiers who might watch that and be horrified that they're being represented in such a way. Because not just like in every instance of life, there's good and bad in everyone and all of us.
Of course, and I think that what that film represents is that film doesn't show that people are either good or bad. It shows that the results of their actions are either good or bad. The soldiers we see are completely varied and different. That when everyone is chanting and getting together to encourage the sergeant to kill the Vietnamese peasants and that they should torch the village, those soldiers normally have nothing in common, but we perceive their actions as being identical.
I just feel that as damning of war as this film is, it's also damning of many of the soldiers that fight in these wars, and not all soldiers act the same way, and this scene specifically portrays them as all buying into this Barnes-like mentality of murdering, raping, complete lack of regard for life. Sheen leaves the camp, Chris leaves the camp, and there's just a bunch of the guys who were smoking up with him casually raping some of the local. And I'm not saying this doesn't happen in war and that it shouldn't be highlighted. It's just this has been highlighted, but in, well, not such an obvious way. This felt really obvious and deliberate to evoke
I
rage.
think this is where our own personal politics sort of come into this, because you've always been more of a help the heroes man, whereas I've been more of a sort of pinko communist Ho Chi Minh sympathizer. But I would say that you do have, as you've mentioned, the best character in this film, and the character who we care about the most, and also the character who we relate to the most. They're two different people, and one is Willem Dafoe's character, and the other is Charlie Sheen's, and both of them break up they're both soldiers who stand up for what they believe in and stop their comrades from doing that. And there's even lots of the lines sort of evoke almost humanist principles when Charlie Sheen says, "She's a person."
That is a good line.
I really feel like that does represent the morality of the soldier. They do have to deal with harrowing circumstances. Some of their comrades do react in horrible ways. That scene did also show that it was only a handful of the soldiers who then continued to rape, and the rest followed their orders and torched the village. And you see Johnny Depp's character, whose name I've completely forgotten, who features in 2 scenes. He carries this little Vietnamese girl out. That you do see instances of humanity and even restraint in the soldiers' part, that there are moments where they know what they're doing is wrong or what they've been ordered to do is wrong. And then you have the character of Barnes, who represents the horrors of war, and Willem Dafoe's character Elias, who sort of represents the ideals that we strive for and how we want our soldiers to behave when in a combat situation. And then Charlie Sheen is torn between the two, but ultimately, if he's representative of, say, the American public or of the public's perception of Vietnam, he ultimately kills Barnes, he kills this evil side, and chooses to adhere to a life that is closer to that of Elias's.
Basically, we've been wanting to speak about this anyway, which is the propaganda that I feel flows through this film.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just pick up straight from what you were talking about, where after he kills Barnes and the battle for his soul, the narration even goes as far as to describe for the audience exactly what the film's supposed to mean, is supposed to represent. When they're on the helicopter out, the narrator, Charlie Sheen, says how Elias and Barnes were fighting for his soul and he was the child that was born out from the two of them. And does Oliver Stone, through the film, really see his audience as being that unintelligent that we couldn't discern that for ourselves? Again, it's what I'm saying about how he has to really hit you over the head with his message, and he can't do anything by halves. There's no subtlety. To actually have a narrator tell you what the film is trying to do is almost insulting, I think.
I wasn't insulted. I'll agree with you there that the end narration was perhaps, even for me, a little much. But it did address the key issue of the film, which is essentially, how does America go on from Vietnam? How does America move on after Vietnam?
Yeah, but it's just the narration itself felt very much like this is Oliver Stone using his wealth, using his contact, to sit down and spend 2 hours
left-wing agenda.
But regardless of politics, I just don't think it's good filmmaking if someone is sitting there.
How do you feel about Battleship Potemkin? I mean, the film as propaganda or film with message, has existed and will exist forever.
But that is a propaganda film. This tries to pretend it's not a propaganda film.
I don't know. I would say we both saw through it, and I don't imagine that Oliver Stone thinks that the rest of his audience won't see through the fact that he has certain views. I think he represents those views fairly clearly, and in fact he's really heavy-handed with them, so we know his whole film is drenched in...
Elias is Jesus Christ, as we've established, and he's very liberal, and he's smoking weed, and he's smiling all the time.
You need to get down.
Was it heroin?
But yeah, I was pretty sure it was heroin.
Really?
I thought so.
Oh. Well,
when the pain disappeared, it could have been marijuana as well.
Oh.
I felt like it was more evil, but maybe it was just some good old reflex.
Maybe.
I'd be happy to be proved wrong.
I've lived a sheltered life.
No, I'd be really happy to be proved wrong.
But regardless, he's a happy hippie. He's smiling at everyone all the time. And then you've got Barnes, who's your grizzled right-wing war veteran. He represents...
Elias is shown to be a war veteran. I mean, he's been there for 3 years.
He is, but he doesn't... He's not...
He kills a lot of Vietnamese people as well.
But Barnes is evil. Barnes is war. Barnes is the...
Is Barnes evil?
Barnes is the machine of war, you know?
Barnes says it best himself, actually. He says, I am reality. When he talks about drug use and chides his fellow soldiers for having to get high to get away from the realities of war, he says, I don't need this shit to face reality. I am reality. Barnes isn't even necessarily evil. Barnes is a representation of the things that need to be done to win the war.
Or is he Oliver Stone's representation of what warmongers say is what needs to be done to win a war? Because that's what I feel that he's going for.
I feel like there's a moment where he addresses the character, and he's supposed to be looking back at the group, but he's obviously looking at the audience, and he says, Death, what do you know about death? I feel that entire scene where he confronts the men, and they know that they want to kill him, and he knows that they want to kill him, that entire scene is essentially him outlining what war is, or describing it, and then asking them and the audience what right do they have to judge his methods. I think Oliver Stone definitely portrays Barnes in a certain light, but I don't think it's as black and white. I don't think that he's entirely down on Barnes.
I mean, he's also got a southern drawl to him.
And a facial scar, which is a definite sign of evil.
It just seemed a bit too much to me. It was too obvious.
Whoever you cast to play him, there would be the issue of, well, they're just portraying these people as evil.
But would it have been a bit more subtle? Had they not cast someone with a Southern American accent?
I don't know. I think it does fit also with his character. The fact that he's grizzled, the fact that he's injured, the moment they say that Barnes has been shot 7 times and survived. Barnes isn't meant to die. The only person who can kill Barnes is Barnes. I didn't have a problem with his casting. I didn't feel that it was especially cliche. I did think that, yes, there is a long tradition of large men with facial scars and southern accents being villains, but at least he wasn't British.
I mean, this film it neglects to bring up any of the context of the actual war itself. For a film that is making a very strong point about the atrocities of the Vietnam War, it doesn't actually really tell you its place in the Vietnam War, what the Vietnam War is even about. It makes no effort to try and inform.
I think it's not about the political impact of that war or what that war served to do. It's about the horror of war, and also the intentions of the Vietnam War are fairly well known.
Well, you'd think that, but not for everyone. Even if you take it as read that everyone knows the purpose of the Vietnam War, I still think if you're going to be addressing the issues that surround it, you need to give the audience some context. A good story will give you context. And I don't feel that this really provided that.
Did you enjoy the film?
I didn't, no.
You didn't enjoy the film at all?
I mean,
So you'd say it was a bad film, because it didn't serve to entertain you?
I'd say that it's a film that has its merits, but I was bored and annoyed by what I felt the director was trying to push upon me, and I didn't feel engaged by it. I almost felt repelled by it. If your views are completely aligned with his, this is just preaching to the choir for you. This will wash over you and you'll be agreeing with everything, and I feel that this isn't something that is going to appeal to everyone because it's just shouting. It's shouting its purpose, and it pushes you away if you're going to question it in any sort of way. If you question the message that it's trying to convey.
I think it leaves a fairly open message. We were talking earlier about the ponderousness of it, or how slow or simple it seemed. I think that because it's so simple, it does leave lots of things open to interpretation. And I feel like lots of it is you get from it what you want to get from it. Yes, there is definitely an underlying political message. Yes, the film is definitely anti-war. I came away from that film having gotten something out of it that it was completely different from what you got from it.
I found that I couldn't enjoy it because I just felt this is a director who believes his own hype and has the means to spout his opinion, and I don't like being forced to sit through these things, and that's why it irked me so much. I feel that this is a poor man's Apocalypse Now.
I don't agree with that at all. I would say that they're both Vietnam War films.
They are.
They're both anti-war films, or films that look at the horrors of war. Apocalypse Now is overrated and is a reskinning of Heart of Darkness that takes the story and puts it in an interesting context. I feel they're about two very different things. They deal with lots of similar issues.
Well, they're both about the horrors of war. It's the approach. Apocalypse Now shows you the horrors of war as a byproduct of its plot, and it explores the madness of war and the nihilistic nature of war. What's it all for? And it shows a descent of human beings, into the heart of darkness. But this film, it's not as subtle as that. It's not as smart as that. It just hits you with its morality issues. Apocalypse Now shows you morality, but it shows you morality in an interesting way, and it still has a strong plot.
A plot that are lifted from a book. But I feel like Apocalypse Now is perhaps the story of a man. It's really about Kurtz. And Platoon is really more about the war itself. The fact that it has a much broader cast. Apocalypse Now has a small group of men on this boat heading towards one man who is the goal, and then they stay there and they all commune and talk. Platoon had a cast of, I'd say maybe 20, perhaps 25, 30 characters, some of whom we only see very, very briefly, some of whom die, but it's really about the platoon.
This one had the lesser of the two Sheens as well.
That is true. I mean, Charlie Sheen perhaps wasn't the best choice. I don't think he was bad in the role, but I do feel the narrative elements weren't as good as perhaps they could have been, and any of their failings were really drawn out by the brevity of his delivery.
Yeah. I think Oliver Stone's only purpose is to have multiple situations where you have different characters representing different aspects of society sat down with each other, talking.
I'm beginning to think that you might have a problem with Oliver Stone.
I don't appreciate anyone, regardless of their politics, with the pretense of creating art, trying to force a message down my throat or anyone's throat. I think you can do this in a much more powerful way if you don't make it so obvious.
I sort of felt that the point of art often is to get a message across.
Definitely. There's many films that do get a strong message across.
I feel like you bring something to this film. You bring your own views, and then you are offered...
Right, the audience member does bring their own views to a film, and that's where you create a dialogue between you as a director and the audience. That's how you really get a message out. That's how you start discussions, by having people go, okay, what did this mean? That was interesting. Why was that there?
I think this
But this film doesn't do that. This film just tells you what you should be thinking and what you should be feeling, and doesn't allow for that dialogue.
To the contrary, this film may have actually started a discussion that we're having now, but I really... It's a
discussion born from rage, but carry on.
Discussion born from rage is still a discussion, but I think that the film's politics are fairly obvious and fairly evident, and you, as a viewer, bring your own views to it, and you leave it having interpreted what you've just seen differently. And I don't think that you necessarily have to share Oliver Stone's political views to have enjoyed the film.
I think there's the bare bones of a great film in there. And the conflict between Barnes and Elias over Charlie Sheen's soul, over Chris's soul, is an interesting conflict to be displayed in a film, But
then this is just it. I feel that there was a fairly simple story with lots and lots of jungle set dressing and strong imagery. There were a couple of incredible set-piece scenes that should have, I hope, brought up strong feelings in the audience. Ultimately, the film offered... perhaps not a nuanced portrayal, but several different other elements and other views on the Vietnam War. I feel that all the scenes that don't address the idea of Chris's soul being up for grabs are addressing the other characters. and are building up the impact of the war on the Vietnamese, or the impact of war on the soldiers as a regiment, now no longer representing individual things, but just on them as people, as characters.
I mean, I don't completely agree. I think we'll leave it at that, and let's move on
Alright.
to some evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, I have evidence to present to the court. Simply that there are quite a few Vietnam War films out, and that Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket specifically are rated higher than Platoon.
Okay.
People hold both of those films in a higher regard in general than they do Platoon, and it's not quite the film that maybe some people think it is. This is all opinion, of course, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay.
So
But I do agree with you that there are two other very famous Vietnam films that have been made, Full Metal Jacket and Apocalypse Now. I, too, have evidence to present in the defence of Platoon, the fact that Oliver Stone is a veteran of that particular conflict.
I mean, my retort to that would be, as far as I'm aware, his experiences only really extend to the early scenes of the wandering and the heat and the...
Some of the bits that you took
Yeah, that I
exception
didn't
to.
enjoy.
Some of the Vietnam War
things
that you
like
didn't enjoy.
things like the village scene are not actually based on that. They're based on...
No, but I wasn't
Other
expecting his
recording.
experiences to be based on that. But I definitely do think it does give someone more of a right to talk about it if they were actually there and did experience.
Yeah, I'm happy to agree with that. I'm not saying that he doesn't deserve to have his say. Just
And I
that
also...
didn't make for good viewing, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Platoon, directed by Oliver Stone, is one of outrageous pretense. It gives him a soapbox from which to stand and to tell us how we should feel about armed conflict, not just in Vietnam, but in general. This is what I gleaned from the film and what I felt that he bludgeoned me over the head with throughout. There was no subtlety to this film, personified by adagio for strings, which was heavily used throughout. It's ponderous, slow-paced, and boring in places. It amounts to what I would call a collection of conversations with the odd action scene dotted here and there. It does culminate in one big action set piece, but there's no focus to this. It's not a focused story, it's a simplistic plot with simplistic morals, and the lesson that he's trying to preach to us is overstated and overbearing and off-putting. And war is hell. This film was hell for me because it was inescapable, and I was trying to watch this as a piece of art, and what I was left with was an overbearing piece of propaganda that I didn't enjoy watching. A good filmmaker could have still imparted the same messages, but without the mallet that Oliver Stone was using to bludgeon us with. It's a good film, but ultimately a pretentious film that's full of melodrama, silly performances in places, and it lost me as an audience member. So I implore you to find this film guilty. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Oliver Stone's Platoon is neither ponderous, pretentious, and it's definitely not propaganda. Well, perhaps a little. But I really can't recommend this film highly enough. It's slow burning, it deals with the atrocities of war in a very nuanced and balanced way. I didn't find its political tones to be offensive or to ruin the film for me. Oliver Stone's own personal experiences of the war helped to inform the filmmaking. It was made on a tiny budget of, I think, only $6 million, and considering what the film is, that's quite an achievement. It tells a story that, while simple, speaks to us all and really humanises its characters. And I feel it deserves to be held up there with the other two great Vietnam War films. Oliver Stone's Platoon is a good film, but nothing. Full stop.
That wraps up the case of movie trialers versus Platoon. Thank you, audience, for joining us. Platoon's fate is down to your verdict. Guilty or not guilty, the decision is yours. I'd like to thank my guest, the defendant, Adam. Thanks, Adam, for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Have you enjoyed yourself?
Yeah, I think we've had a very interesting discussion. I don't agree with you at all, but
No one ever does.
no. You should think about that.
I just couldn't love this film.
I did really enjoy it. Perhaps I'll someday see what you see in it or vice versa, but I did really enjoy the film, and I enjoyed debating it with you.
I'm glad. And you'll be back again, no doubt.
No doubt.
Thanks again. If you've enjoyed this, be sure to check out our other movie trials and be sure to have your say. Comment below. Any support will be appreciated. We have been the Movie Trialers. Goodbye for now, and until next time.
Order! Order! Silence! Members of the jury, you decide. Based on the evidence presented in court by both parties, what is your verdict? Guilty or not guilty?